Some of my favorite horror stories are metaphor, where that horror is used to explore deeper stories with people at the center. Films like Hereditary, books like House of Leaves, even films like It Follows, which, if you pay close attention, is far more than a story about an STD monster. But This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, the book I'm going to talk about today, is one of those stories. But let us begin with the hook. What is This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno about? Thiago has lost his wife in a tragic accident. He finds himself in a fugue while friends and family suffocate him. His solution is to start anew, so he moves to a remote area of Colorado and holes up in a cabin, hoping the demons won't chase him. Little does he know, those demons did more than hitch a ride. So what did I think? Well, let us begin with character and let us begin with Thiago. He is our protagonist. Now, this novel is told in first person, so it's a very intimate POV, and we get a very intimate view at his psyche. Thiago is kind of the everyman. He doesn't have a lot going for him. He has these odd jobs, like he's an Uber driver, and his wife, before she died, was kind of the breadwinner. She was keeping everything afloat. The reason why I'm contradicting myself is I didn't really feel that it detracted from the story. I didn't feel like that's what Gus Moreno was trying to do. I think Gus Moreno was trying to create an everyman, create a proxy, as I always say, a normal character for us to really get deep into the story, right? Rather than focusing on the character and who he was and what he was about, this is more about his experiences. And it's beautifully demonstrated in the first part. And I'll talk more about this in the structure section and the writing section. But the first part, when he's at her funeral, at his wife's funeral, surrounded by family friends and family members, it works so well because it's almost as if reality and his past experiences with his wife kind of blend together. And they're weaving in and out, almost as if we are along for the ride, this crazy ride, this very hazy ride. And because the story is told this way, again, particularly in the first part, the first quarter of this book, his wife feels like a real character. She feels living and breathing more than a ghost, even though she never exists on the page. Every time we hear about her and everything we learn about her is through Thiago's POV, him looking back on their life together. And looking back on the book, that is probably one of the best things about this novel, is how Gus Moreno was able to create a living, breathing, fleshed out character who we never get to meet on the page. Let us talk about the plot next, and this book is structured in 4 parts. Now, that's not incredibly unique, but what was kind of different is there are no chapters in this book. There are these very short scenes broken up by asterisks, by scene breaks, but that's it. So you have 4 really long chapters, I guess you could say. Normally, I hate that. I love short chapters. And granted, the scene breaks were frequent, but they still don't feel like chapter breaks. And while I'm always harping on scene construction, I think it was done so great in this novel because he's not in his right mind half the time. His memories, his experiences, all of these things, his reality is fractured. It comes and goes, and we experience this along with him because of that construction. The first part is about him at his wife's funeral, coming into contact with family friends and family, of course. But again, like I said, he's drifting to the past often, so we're also learning about their past life together. And so while it felt a little bit long, I think that was the point. I think Moreno was trying to drag us through this phase of grief that Thiago was going through. Part 2 is when he decides to start anew. He heads off to Colorado, and this is probably my favorite part of the entire book. This is when the plot really kicks into gear. And it has one of my favorite scenes when Thiago is, he stops by a roadside diner, and it's empty, with the exception of the owner. And they have a friendly conversation until it gets kind of weird. It gets kind of weird. It just had that element of horror I love so much. Such a beautiful scene turn because it seems ordinary. You start to notice things aren't quite right. And then it goes deeper and deeper and deeper and then pulls back. And then I won't spoil the rest of it for you, but I felt like that was such a well-crafted scene. It's incredibly memorable. To me, that's the kind of content I love in horror novels. It's got the dread, it's got the tension, it has the great scene turn. And the rest of the book, of course, is when the horror starts ratcheting up. And there are some definite nods to horror films out there. However, normally I criticize that, but they are not on the nose. I wouldn't say that they are incredibly well hidden or anything like that, but they weren't so obvious that they kind of pulled you out of the story. So while things get weirder and weirder and weirder in the 3rd act or the 4th act, if you want to argue that, This book kind of ends in a disappointing way. Endings are difficult, as we all know, but I think the lack of a great conclusion to this book was only enhanced by the great foundation, by the great beginning. And without spoiling anything, I'll just say it kind of devolves into what you've seen 1,000 times. Very tropey, very generic, which was very surprising considering how great the first 2/3 of the novel are. There's also Mexican folklore at the heart of this, and I love folklore and horror, especially unconventional or little known folklore. Like there's a great part when Thiago is reminiscing about his life with his wife, and weird stuff happens even back then before she dies. They get this smart speaker called an Itza, I-T-Z-A. It's like an Alexa or a Google Home. But anyway, when I read that title, I knew exactly it had to be something, so I looked it up. And in fact, the Itza were a Mayan ethnic group. So I love that there's these little hints, these little subtextual things that exist that aren't overt, they're not in your face. And in fact, that is the part of the book, the very beginning, the first quarter, that the horror starts to rear its little head. And there are other folklore elements, but I would like you to discover those on your own. But overall, an engaging plot. I was never bored reading this. It was an extremely quick read, an easy read, a book that I wanted to keep returning to. All right, let's talk about the writing next, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. Well, as I mentioned, I think that Moreno painted a beautiful, maybe that's the wrong word, a deep look at grief and what it's like to suffer a terrible loss, particularly in the first part, as I mentioned, because the writing, it just weaves in and out of reality. It's like stream of consciousness. It feels as if Thiago is just laying his thoughts out on paper. And the beautiful thing here, I forgot to mention when I talked about character, is he's really talking to his wife the entire time. He's speaking to her. And that is how we get such a great picture of who she was. Even though she never speaks to us, him addressing her for the entirety or most of the book anyway, really gave us that deep connection. And so whereas a lot of first-person narratives are about someone dictating a story or someone writing a story down in a journal for someone else to find, this one is strictly between Thiago and his wife. Moreno is also great, as I mentioned, at building dread, at building tension, at building horror. I just wish it was a little bit more prevalent because, as I mentioned, the strongest scene in the entire novel was the diner scene, in my opinion. And if there had been more scenes like that, this book would have been so great. Overall, a very easy read. It never got tiring. It never was arduous. There is one thing I would like to talk about, though, and that is what I like to call product placement. It's not technically product placement. Stephen King does this all the time. Joe Hill does this all the time. You know, ironically enough, they're related. But anyway, it's when a writer uses brands all the time in the writing. So brands like Amazon, Coca-Cola, Uber, whatever it may be. For whatever reason, it takes me out of the book. It takes me out of the story. Maybe it's because I work in marketing for a living, so I'm always assaulted by brands, but it puts this definitive timestamp on it. It calls attention to itself. Many of you out there may not be bothered by it whatsoever. In fact, you may enjoy it because it may make everything feel more real because you recognize all of these brands. You can go to the store and buy one of these things, so it all feels even more closer to home. But for me, it's like reading a line of bad dialogue. It's like reading a line of jarring prose. It just kind of takes me out of the experience. And maybe that's just unique to me, but I thought I would bring it up, which is why I'm going to give This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno a 7 out of 10. A horror novel that deeply explores grief, starting over, and how sometimes we can't outrun either, with believable characters navigating terrible, terrible times. And a plot that moves as fast as it needs to, with at least one creepy moment, and writing that is both effective and accessible. Well, that is the end of the review. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know, did you read This Thing Between Us? Did you like it? Did you not like it? I can still highly recommend this novel. I think it's worth your time. It's a short read. There's some great things about it. And I'm always looking for unique reads in the horror genre. If you'd like to check out my own work, my own novels, you can check out the Amazon link down in the description of this video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.